Let me ring the bell and then I'll come back into my announcements.
Good morning and welcome everybody. Day 3 of the Cash Week, about to kick off. I'm just going to let Rose do a quick walk through the key points from a health and safety point of view, and then kick us off properly.
Hi everyone. So just quickly, for those of you who may not have been here for the last couple of days, if you hear the fire alarm, it is not a test, so please do leave the building as quickly and calmly as possible. You just go out of these doors and the stairs, you'll see the green sign just in front of you and down the stairs. And then you'll be ushered in the right direction. For lunch and coffees, etc. You've already found where the coffee is. Lunch will also be here. If you have any specific dietary requirements, do please just say so when you're in the queue for the buffet for lunch. And we will be doing some group work after the break, but we won't be rearranging this room. So you can leave your bits and pieces on the chairs today. I think that's everything. The Wi-Fi password is behind me. Any other questions, do please just come and tap me on the shoulder and I'll endeavour to help. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Rose. Once again, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anna Kondakchan. I'm the Global Programs Coordinator with CALP. I'm one of the co-organizers of this event. And it's last year I was here as a participant. It's great to be back as a one of the presenters and the organizers. We today put a spotlight on a critical issue that I believe impacts ability of CVA actors to operate at scale, operate where assistance is most needed, and operate fast. And you guessed it, we're going to be talking about risk. It's easy, I think, as CALP to frame the conversation starting from where we often start by highlighting that from the State of the World's Cash report, there's a perception that CVA is inherently riskier than other modalities of aid, and this is seen as a key barrier to scale. Some argue that we've already achieved scale, huge growth in the last 2 years. We're now at 4.7 billion. So it's now time to focus on quality and time to address those barriers. In terms of perception that risk CVA is inherently riskier, through research and evidence that CALP has done and others in our network, we know that it actually doesn't hold true. Anyone still in doubt? There's great evidence in CALP's Yemen and Mali case studies, and there's some other excellent resources on CALP's cash and risk thematic page. And also, hot off the press, we've just completed a short animation video that we're going to be playing shortly for you that helps to debunk some of the myths around the risk in CVA. Some of you were here on Monday, so I was here and I added a new acronym to my long list, and it was KISS. Oh, it's playing? Not yet. Ignore, okay. I'll just wait for ignore what's happening behind me. Anyway, I added a new acronym to my list, and it was KISS. And when I saw it, I was like, well, what is this about? So it's apparently keep it simple. So I wanted to try and keep things simple with risk and take us back to basics. Essentially, what are we talking about? An uncertain event or change that may affect the achievement of objectives. And it's inherent in humanitarian crisis. So we are in a very risky business. Preparing for this, I was scanning through the latest evidence, and there's quite a powerful report from the Center of Strategic International Studies that I'm going to quote verbatim. Principled humanitarian action is under attack all around the world, and access barriers manifest differently, from violence and insecurity to bureaucratic constraints through counterterrorism regulation and funding. And in relation to this, I wanted to highlight two events that I think are relevant to the conversation today. Both of them relate to Nigeria. Although access barriers apply to all modalities of assistance, some of them, specifically counterterrorism related and anti-money laundering, are more acute in CVA programming than in other types of assistance. In early November, New Humanitarian reported that an ambiguous counterterrorism clause was added to all grants by the biggest funder in Nigeria. As far as we know, only one agency turned down funding as a result. That essentially the clause was asking implementing agencies to vet those in need of humanitarian assistance prior to providing cash assistance. As I said, only one agency was turned down the funding. We also know through the work that CAB's done convening actors, we know that this isn't a unique event. We know that similar practices are taking place in other regions. And this results in very difficult ethical choices for CVA practitioners, essentially choice between humanitarian principles and maintaining access and trust relationship in the community versus maintaining access to funding and legal compliance. Now, of course, there are many drivers for going digital in CVA delivery. There's an opportunity to go to scale. There's an opportunity to be more effective and more efficient. But I fear, and I think I'm not the only one who thinks this way, is that this choice of digital delivery method sometimes is driven by the need to comply with the counterterrorism and AML measures. Which then creates a whole new set of risks around data management and around financial compliance, and also working with the private sector. So these all need to be unpacked. And going back to the case of Nigeria, the second example I wanted to flag for today's discussion is that in September, there were reports that the country is to receive over 400 million from the World Bank for biometric ID registration at a national scale. Again, huge opportunity for the millions of Nigerians who are currently excluded from the formal ID, but also huge potential for surveillance and data management risks. And this isn't a unique case. Again, we've seen how access to aid has been conditioned on use of biometric technology in Yemen as one example to prevent diversion. So also going back to previous days at the Cash Week, on Monday, I think it was Meg who gave us a perfect recipe or a recipe for a perfect marriage. It was accountability plus cash equals better aid. So I was thinking about it, and actually if we apply this to the concept of risk versus accountability, in order to realize this happy marriage, it also means that we need to be managing the tension between risk and accountability that continues to shape humanitarian space. So how does it manifest itself at the moment? I think what we're seeing is that this drive for greater accountability within the humanitarian system actually translates to less tolerance for taking risk. In some cases, zero tolerance for taking risk. And then you have situations that Emma was talking about yesterday, where you have essentially transfer of risk downstream to implementing partners, further transfer. I mean, how far can this transfer go? Actually, it maybe is a moment to stop and think what would be the result of this downstream transfer of risk. And I mean, maybe I'm stating the obvious, but actually it is introducing further structural risk, where you have situations where humanitarian operations will become difficult to fund and implement, and the needs of the communities ultimately become unmet. And I'm hoping that today we'll be able to explore how we can actually shift the balance so that we can move from this transfer of risk downstream to more of a sharing of risk approach among all the players in the ecosystem and in this beautiful garden that we've started to grow that Lars Peter was talking about yesterday. I also need to point out that CALP has actually done quite a lot of work in the run-up to the Cash Week to inform the conversation today. So apologies to the panelists for projecting just behind them, but on data responsibility, which is a one dimension of risk that we are going to be diving in today, we've convened conversations starting from April with friends from OCHA Humanitarian Data Center and the ICRC in Geneva to start unpacking what data responsibility means for humanitarian CVA and what are the key areas that need to be prioritized. And out of this workshop emerged the need to unpack data sharing as a key subject, and also linked to that, how organizations can translate policies at the HQ level into practical action in the field. We've covered this topic since in 2 webinars that some of our panelists today actually took part in, and we'll be exploring further. And then more broadly on risk in CVA and the impact of countering terrorism measures and AML, we've also organized events in West Africa and in MENA region. Some of them were closed-door discussions, so we're at the moment still figuring out the best way to bring the key takeaways from this conversation into the public domain. But some of the themes, broad themes from this conversation will feed into the 2 workshops that we have lined up for you today. And finally, this is a season of launching new products within CALP. So linked to the AMLCT, today we're launching a risk scoping study, which is in your reading packs on your chairs, and we're going to be presenting in one of the workshops. Also, feel free to take a look at the recommendations from the 2 events in West Africa, summary recommendations, also in your packs. And just really quickly, let me check with Roses, are we able to play the videos now? Okay. Probably the animation first. So first video is the one that helps debunk the myths around CVA being riskier than other modalities. Fingers crossed.
According to the Cash Learning Partnership State of the World's Cash Report, the perception that cash is an inherently risky modality is still the biggest barrier to more effective and extensive use of cash and voucher assistance, or CVA. However, evidence has shown that CVA is no riskier than other modalities. In some cases, it can be less risky than more traditional forms of aid, especially in digital form, as it is easier to track and more discreet to deliver, but it does present different risks to other modalities. To make sure CVA is used whenever it is the most appropriate modality, we must identify and dispel these myths one by one. Myth 1. CVA is riskier for crisis-affected people. Digital channels and new technologies mean that humanitarian agencies no longer need to transport physical cash to people in emergencies, reducing security risks. However, with digital channels of delivery, humanitarian agencies need to collect data from end users and ensure they take into account their needs and preferences and any digital literacy constraints. There are unique risks associated with the digital delivery of CVA, and these need to be understood and mitigated to put the protection of crisis-affected people at the centre of humanitarian response. Myth number 2. CVA is riskier for donors. There is no evidence of cash being more prone to diversion than other modalities. Some studies suggest that losses from or diversion of cash transfers are around 2% on average, compared with up to 50% for some in-kind aid. In fact, because CVA is direct and involves few intermediaries, in high-risk environments it can be an effective tool to avoid diversions. However, in high-risk environments, compliance requirements designed to mitigate diversion risks, such as individual beneficiary vetting, do create additional reputational and security risks. These must be understood and mitigated to uphold humanitarian principles. Myth number 3. CVA is riskier for implementing agencies. When it comes to delivering CVA, humanitarian agencies must manage large amounts of data, often in partnership with other organisations, including financial service providers. They are also required to comply with donor legislation, but by investing upfront to build the systems necessary to deliver CVA safely and effectively, we can ensure less risk over the long term. Humanitarian agencies are starting to develop policies around data sharing and put agreements in place with partners. By working together, implementing agencies can share best practice and push for open dialogue with donors around expectations for risk management and risk sharing. Myth number 4. Working with private sector actors to deliver CVA is risky. Private sector organisations, such as financial service providers, are an essential part of the delivery of CVA. Some humanitarian actors are concerned that involving private sector actors, who are not bound by humanitarian principles, could put recipients at risk. However, in order to address the huge challenges of meeting humanitarian need at scale, we need the best skills, the best ideas, and the best reach available. Humanitarian flows in crisis contexts amount to only a very small part of total funding available. The recipients of humanitarian assistance are already engaging with a range of actors. By working more closely with private sector partners from the outset in a principled manner, we can help ensure more effective, efficient, and user-centered assistance for people in crisis. The Cash Learning Partnership is helping to navigate these challenges by generating evidence and convening actors at global and regional events and webinars to share experiences and best practices. Find out more about our work on our website.
Thank you. Thank you, Rose. I think we'll play the second one maybe a bit later. Is that okay? Okay. A couple more announcements before I can introduce our panelists and we move into the into that part of the morning. Firstly, that with after the panel and after the coffee break, we have two very exciting workshops lined up for you. One will be facilitated by Linda, and it's looking at the sort of looking at addressing the feedback that we often get from practitioners who feel paralyzed when it comes to data responsibility and data management. Sort of, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I know that I'm supposed to be responsible with my data, but I don't really know where to start. So There'll be some individual reflection, but also an opportunity to reflect on the level of readiness of your organization and how can you move yourself and your organization along the data maturity path. So that's one. And two is very much in collaboration with our members, Norwegian Refugee Council, and experts in AMLCT. So Emma O'Leary, Tim, and Roger will be deep diving into the question of the impact of countering terrorism measures and anti-money laundering on humanitarian CVA. Please don't be concerned. You won't miss out. So you'll have an opportunity to actually be in both workshops. We'll be splitting you in groups, and Martin can give more instructions. But as we prepare for it, there'll be a Twitter poll running, and so we'd really like you to get voting with your thumbs on the question of the impact of AMLCT. That's one. And as I introduced the panel, also to flag that we'll be recording a podcast at lunchtime, zooming in on the question of informed consent versus, or how realistic is it to have informed and freely given consent in CVA operations. So again, feel free to send your questions that you'd like the podcasters to address as we're recording. You can do that on Twitter by tagging @CashLearning, or just give them to myself or to Rose in the break. So, okay, enough of me talking. Certainly enough for me. I'm really pleased to have here an amazing panel of experts in digital data and ethical uses of technology. We thought we should start practicing what we preach, and in true spirit of collaboration and expanding our horizons, we're inviting people with expertise in an area that we as CVA practitioners actually that still have a long way to go. So and all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about responsible data management, these are you guys. Starting from Jos Behrens, who is with OCHA Humanitarian Data Center as the data policy officer. We have Sebastian Manhard, who is the Chief Operating Officer with Simprints, an ethical biometrics company, if I may describe it that way. We have Amos Dombos, who is the Digital Technology Director with World Vision International, and an active member of CCD, and an active blogger and podcaster, I should say. And we have Rick Tai, who is the Program Data Specialist and Global Advisor on uses of technology in humanitarian with Oxfam. And finally, last but by no means least, Linda Raftery, who is an independent consultant specializing in ethical uses of digital data, advising donors, advising implementing organizations, and doing a lot of work also with practitioners. Today, what we want to focus on in this panel is the tension between responsible and otherwise digital data use. The tension between digital data use to mitigate perception of risk that we were talking about earlier, misappropriation, double dipping, vetting, and the opportunity to streamline operation to reach vulnerable groups at scale. We'll be asking how can we elevate the practice so that our data choices and decisions are protecting the end user whilst allowing our organizations to meet legal and compliance requirements. I know these are tough questions, but we need to start diving into it. So I'm going to start with you, Rick, if that's okay. we know that Oxfam developed its responsible data policy long before GDPR came into place. I'm assuming everybody in the room knows what GDPR is. So I don't need to unpack that. Sorry. What it really is, but what it stands for, I should say. Okay. So why did Oxfam choose to take a rights-based approach in its policy, and where is Oxfam now with this data practice post-policy?
Thank you. So as Anna mentioned, for us as a team and organisation, this kind of process started about 4.5 years ago when we developed our first responsible data policy internally. And then that was followed up with our responsible data management kind of training pack, which was a way of trying to socialise this within the organisation. So it wasn't just another HQ have come up with a policy. Great, tick the box, we're done, move on. But trying to really embed it within our program work and with our program teams. And that pack was co-developed with our humanitarian protection team. So very much looking at individuals and their rights. So this wasn't so much a compliance and legal exercise. This was about recognizing individuals having rights and responsibility and power over their own data and what role we play within that. And we've done training sort of between ourselves and the protection team in around 20 or 30, sort of between 20 and 30 countries now, trying to build up that knowledge and understanding of what it means, looking at that rights-based approach. And for me, it's that we have a moral and ethical obligation when we're collecting, storing, managing, and deleting data, which we tend to be particularly bad at that last part. Recognizing the risk isn't so much on us, but on the individuals whose data we are holding and processing. Now, I want to mention GDPR, and for us as a team, the purpose of it was it got a huge amount of senior management buy-in on this topic. So a topic that we'd been trying to push for a while, not necessarily getting that much senior buy-in. Suddenly, this big, giant, kind of looming GDPR appeared, which had big compliance and legal implications. Suddenly, a whole load of people paid attention and sat up. And it focused people's minds on data protection, on privacy, but still not on that rights-based approach. So though it was very helpful, and it got more resources and more attention internally, it was still, for us, slightly in the wrong direction. And I think for a lot, particularly when you're talking fines and reputational damage, it was that focus on first-party risk. What is the risk to our organisation if we get something wrong? Whereas what we are trying to advocate is, well, we need to look at that third-party risk. Yes, there's a risk to us if we get something wrong, but there's a far greater risk on these, often very vulnerable individuals if we screw something up with their data, if we lose their data. So that's what we've been focusing on and trying to build the capacity and knowledge internally, but also with our partners as well. So working with kind of local partners, but also technology and financial services providers, particularly when we're looking at cash, to try and help them understand where we're going and trying to make sure we're working with partners who are meeting these same kind of standards that we're striving towards. And for me, a recent good example, even in the last 2 weeks, I got a message from one of our country teams who are looking to work with a new financial services provider who have biometrics as just a core offering of their sort of standard solution. And the team, one of the places we've done the training in, wanted to kind of just check that they were doing this in the right way, that the partner was one we could work with and trust. So we've then been able to link them with our cash team, with our data protection officer. We now have a data rights team who sits around our data protection officer, and really start looking at that joined up picture of, well, what is the program problem we're trying to solve, and then work back to, is this the right technology? And if it is, are they following the right information security processes, and getting really into that technical detail, but we still come down to what's the problem we're trying to solve, and does collecting these types of data help? So that's always the kind of first point for us. And I guess I'll hand over in a moment, but for me it's that if we do the rights-based approach right, and we lead with that, the moral and ethical side, the legal kind of compliance is a natural kind of byproduct of that. So we get the GDPR compliance if we focus on the moral and ethical, and it doesn't necessarily go the other way. So if you just focus on legal, you can miss out that step around individuals and their data.
Thanks, Rick. Already some food for thought there in terms of third-party risk, not first-party risk. As we get fixated, it's not about the organization, it's about the individuals we're trying to reach. On that note, Amos, so we had a great conversation with the panel yesterday morning when we were looking at emerging. I cannot get away from the term, sorry, from the emerging operational models, which are not actually operational models, but then new ways of operating in an ecosystem. And it sounded as though a lot of progress has been made on the holy grail of interoperability and data sharing in these operating models. What's your reflection? Being in the midst of these discussions, what does the practice look like of navigating this data sharing?
Thanks, Anna. I think it's good to be here. I think if the Holy Grail has been found, that would be wonderful. I think part of the notion of the Holy Grail is that it's never actually found, but we keep striving after it. And I think that's probably true around the Holy Grail of data interoperability or system interoperability. I think one of the things that I would argue is that almost system interoperability and data interoperability is probably a red herring, to use a UK term. What would be the, sorry, that's a culturally inappropriate term. It's something, it's a distraction. That probably translates better. In a sense of that it's often more about data governance than it is about system interoperability. If we really want to, we can get enough people in a room to figure out how to get systems to talk to each other. We can figure out, to get a system to talk to another system, it may be messy, but we can get it to work. Usually it's about making sure that we understand what are the terminology in one system, how are things put into that system, what's the terminology in the other system, how do we get those two systems to kind of communicate and talk, resolve the differences, resolve the problems that come up, and figure out, what's the direction of travel, which one rules over the other one, when there's conflict and stuff like that. In some respect, that's the easy part. The governance piece is much more important because it actually gives you the standards and the methodology that sits around the system interoperability or the data interoperability. And I think that's really where the hard part is because there you deal with power. And we all are parts of organizations of various different sizes and frankly, and power. And then you have the beneficiaries as well, who are also in the mix, and they also have a different sense of power and control over, say, data or over systems and stuff like that. And we have to figure out. So for me, part about it, how do we share data and how do we create interoperability, is dealing with the governance questions. And as we deal with them, then we can make progress much more easily, I think, on the how do we get systems to talk to each other. I think often in the data sharing conversation, we have to get into the detail. And a lot of us, frankly, don't like detail. And it's kind of the human side also of the equation that often I feel it gets missed out on. So if we think about, so one would be, what's the purpose, right? Kind of Rick used the phrase, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Are we actually clear on that? What's the purpose? What's the end goal that we're trying to seek towards? So if we talk about data sharing, if I'm sharing data with Seb, is the end result that we both have the exactly same data set in our organizations and in our databases, or just the data that we need? And if it's just the data that we need, who defines what that need is? And I think tying it into, sorry to use the term, operating models, historically, kind of when we work in consortiums, so World Vision is part of the CCD, as well as probably countless other consortiums as well, like most of us in the room. Historically, consortiums tend to be organized geographically. So based on, we're working in one area, Oxfam's working in another area, we're doing the same thing as part of this project, but we're in different geographical areas. The other way that tends to organize consortiums is sector-based. Oxfam does water in these two geographical areas. World Vision, let's say, does cash, for argument's sake, in those two areas. But we're working with the same communities and same people. What is starting to emerge is the ecosystem approach, or the functional approach, or whatever term we'll call it in the future. That becomes much more difficult because in the previous consortium model, you had a prime, generally speaking, you had a donor, he gives money to a prime who subcontracts to different places, and it kind of rolls up that way. And you don't actually have to share too much data between organizations other than this is what we've done. As we move into the ecosystem or functional kind of operating model, there's a lot more interaction that needs to happen. And so we need, we can look at how do banks share, how do you do bank transfers, so the whole SWIFT, the SWIFT codes, if you ever transfer money internationally, a SWIFT code, you may not know what it is, but you have to use one. That methodology was developed not that long ago to deal with how do you share data across the banks. Airlines do it when you check in. So one of the things that the CCD and World Vision and myself and there's an organization called Digital Public out of the US who's also who's done a lot of work looking into it, is around the concept of a data trust. So rather than having one organization be responsible for the data, is there a way that you can have a trust, which is a legal entity that the data resides in, and so it's outside of any of the implementing agencies or organizations, but it sits separately, and it controls who has access to that particular data and how that data, and actually in a data trust, or usually in a trust that, in our case, the beneficiary would also have a role there and is enabling kind of to hold the users of the data to account much more easily than in our current models. I think I would say we're in a really messy stage, and I think that's part of the change that we're going through. It is a bit messy, and when we talk about risk, I think it really depends on who's around the table or who's in the discussion. Actually dictates often how risk is defined. And so if the people sitting around or in the discussion are only certain types of organizations, you're going to be defining risk in a certain way. If you get a bunch of IT people in a room, they're going to define risk in one way. A bunch of lawyers will define risk in a different way. A bunch of accountability gurus will define risk also differently, and so on. And it's, for me, probably in our work and as we move forward with data interoperability and data sharing, the most important thing that we can do is make sure that we have a huge diversity of voices in the discussion around when we're talking about sharing data amongst organizations. And we also have to realize that there is no right answer. I don't believe that there's a right answer, that it's a lot about trade-offs. And what we decide is the best way forward, let's say in Kenya, in that particular context, even those same group of people may make a different decision in Bangladesh. And I recognize that that makes a lot of people, especially senior leadership in many of our organizations, nervous. But I think that's part of the path that we have to figure out how to move forward in, because one size will never fit all in this.
Thanks, Amos. Diversity of voices, or diversity of plants in the garden, continuing with yesterday's analogy, is so important. But also this notion of trade-offs, I think, definitely resonates with the risk conversation. You have to be prepared to accept a degree of risk and make some compromises along the way. And yes, there was some excitement yesterday about the data trust. So I'm sure there'll be a couple of people here who want to pick your brain about that a bit more. Rick included. Okay. Now, looking from the UN perspective, Jos, I know that OCHA organized, an HDX, I should say, organized a high-level conference in Wilton Park earlier this year, all focused around the question of data responsibility. So why did you feel that was needed, and what's been the outcome of that? And also, if you can talk a little bit about what my experience in the CVA is that we tend to get really fixated with the notion of personally identifiable data, but it's now quite clear from the conversations that we've had that we need to be looking broader at other sensitivities. So if you can touch on that as well, it would be amazing. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna, and thank you to CALP for having me here. So my name is Jos Berends. I'm with the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, based in The Hague. We were launched in December of 2017. And we work along 4 main work streams, and I'll briefly mention them because I think some of it may be relevant to members of the audience here. So first of all, we work on data services, which includes our work on the humanitarian data exchange and the humanitarian exchange language, which you may be familiar with. So it's a platform for online sharing of any data relevant to humanitarian response. Then we do work around data literacy, and we're now in the process of guiding our first cohort of humanitarian affairs officers through a course around data literacy. We recently launched a work stream around predictive analytics, which really relates to the work that we're doing and some of you may have seen the lecture that our Undersecretary General Mark Lowcock gave on Monday here in London, actually at LSE, on moving from let's say, the traditional reactionary approach of the humanitarian system to a more anticipatory approach. So our predictive analytics work aims to contribute to that. And then finally, we work on data policy, and that's really the work stream where I work. And our data policy work focuses around this concept of data responsibility. And Anna, you were just mentioning personal data and the focus on personal data, and why maybe that's not all that there is to this conversation. So given the role that OCHA plays as the coordinator of humanitarian response, it probably makes sense that we don't process these huge volumes of personally identifiable information, or such as registration data or other personal data. We tend to focus on aggregated data, which can still be potentially sensitive. Right, so even if data doesn't reveal insights about any particular individual, if a group can be identified, that data can still be considered sensitive and should be treated as such. So that's really one part to this concept of data responsibility that our work focuses on. The other is that traditionally data protection policies and data protection frameworks really focus on preventing risk. And we go a step further by also focusing on let's say, preventing misuse. So not only looking at misuse, but also preventing misuse of data. By which we mean if data has been collected and it's just sitting there, then it may be potentially creating risk without creating any benefit. And so preventing this misuse is an important part of our work. So we do this work on data responsibility, and we work on a couple of main things. The first is that we released a working draft of our data responsibility guidelines for OCHA in March of this year. It's hopefully a very practical document, which gives concrete guidance along a series of steps that are typically involved in data management. So that leads from data collection or receiving data, through analyzing data, all the way to retention and destruction. And so we aim to be as concrete as possible. It also includes the recommendation to conduct early risk assessments when doing a data management exercise. And an example of such a risk assessment, I think, can be found in some of the recent work that CALP has published in the Safer Data Toolkit. Next to this work on guidelines, we have just released or just announced work that we'll be doing on case studies in data responsibility for humanitarian action. And this is work that we're doing together with the World Economic Forum. So what we see, and this also came up during the Wilton Park conversations, is that a lot of these conversations around risk tend to be pretty theoretical and abstract. And what we're aiming to do through this case study work is to really have a look at what risk and also best practice looks like on the ground. And so we'll be doing 2 field missions to collect, let's say, evidence of data responsibility in humanitarian action. The other 2 things I'll briefly mention because I think they're relevant here, and then I'll hand back over to Anna, is that we're doing a series of guidance notes on topics of data responsibility, and the 2 next guidance notes that we'll be releasing will focus on public-private partnerships, which is of course a topic that's highly relevant here. And so it will contain advice for both the humanitarian partner and the private sector partner on how to create these types of partnerships in a sustainable manner. One of which relates to, I think, something that came up during the in the animation just now, which is that private sector actors are not necessarily bound by the humanitarian principles. And so humanitarians versus private sector actors will come at these conversations from with a very different mindset. And so creating a shared goals in a project is one thing to help sort of align those mindsets a bit better. The other guidance note that we're producing will focus on data ethics, and part of the description of this panel was how ethics can relate to policies and regulation or other guidance. And so this ethics note will go a bit into the different ethical frameworks that can apply to the use of data in humanitarian action, including the humanitarian ethics, so let's say the humanitarian principles and some of the work that Hugo Slim has been writing about, versus the sort of the data ethics conversation, which focuses very much on how data should be managed and the principles behind that. So how do we align those 2 and make sure together they form a coherent ethical framework for the use of data in humanitarian response? I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jos. I like that as a takeaway, misuse, not just misuse of data, and lots of good guidance to look forward to as well. And actually, opportune you mentioned the public-private partnership, because we're going to be next moving to a private sector representative. Seb, I know you. We've talked about the deliberate strategy that Simprint took of impact partnerships, and more recently, also perhaps said for us that you've also chosen to move away from the humanitarian CVA, hopefully not for good, but for the time being. So it would be great if you can reflect on why this was a deliberate choice, and also what were some of the experiences you've had that contributed to that choice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, sure. And I think my contribution can hopefully play directly into myth 4 around sort of private sector involvement. Just to signpost this, I'm taking from my experience at Simprint as CEO, where I oversee our global partnerships, but also our privacy function. But I also sit on the board of the Ethics and Risk Committee of ID 2020, which you might know. It's essentially an organization, a global alliance that is trying to improve standards around good ID across programs. I'm not going to talk about how exactly a biometric system in humanitarian development works. I'm not going to talk about the benefits of biometrics. If you're interested in that, you can grab me later. I really want to provide you with a framework that I found quite useful, thinking about risk and the use of very sensitive data, and some specific examples and case studies that I think we have from our experience. Quick background, Simprint is a non-profit technology company, and our mission is to increase transparency and effectiveness in global development as a whole. We do so by working with NGOs, but mainly ministries, and we try to answer a very simple question, which is what's going on in my program? And we do this through the use of various technologies, biometrics, geolocation, machine learning, data analytics, but essentially all to answer the simple question, what's going on in my program? We've worked in around 12 countries, mainly in healthcare, and our biggest programs are child and maternal healthcare programs in Bangladesh and Ethiopia. And we also have some experience in humanitarian assistance, especially cash transfers that I'm going to touch on. But let me start with sort of, as you can imagine, we deal with, we have up to date over 300,000 people enrolled in our system. So we're dealing with a lot of highly sensitive data of very vulnerable people. And so how have we made that choice essentially as a nonprofit and very mission-driven, values-driven organization of operating in this sector? So I want to introduce a framework that is very common in the software development world, which is sort of the trade-offs between security and utility. And essentially the idea there is there's no dichotomy, there's no sort of, just absolute good when you make a decision. It's always a trade-off. And making a very simple example, in your organization, you can maximize utility by giving everyone can use their own laptop and do whatever the hell they want. You can maximize security by having people only work on highly secured PCs in their office. Another example might be data use. You can have your global data available in raw form to every employee in the organization so that they can do whatever they want with it and do all the data analysis they want. You might maximize utility, but if you want to maximize security, it's sandboxed data in the cloud that people can only access with specific queries without ever having access to the raw data. Biometrics example, you might want to maximize utility by having raw images of fingerprints available to 10 different organizations operating in a consortium. But from a security perspective, that's an absolute nightmare. From a security perspective, you might want to have hashed proprietary templates stored in the cloud that no one has actually access to. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a trade-off. You can maximize utility at the expense of security. But there's an additional layer which I think is really interesting, which is you can very often keep the security while increasing the utility, but that has a very high cost. So coming back to the data analytics example, you can create a sandbox environment where people can send certain queries and get the response they need without ever accessing that data, but setting that system up will have a very high cost. And frankly, sometimes, even with a high cost, you can't do it, and you will just have to compromise on security. So let's bring this to sort of our case studies. One example is, I would say that we say no to 4 to 5 opportunities coming our way. For every opportunity, we do a very rigorous essentially due diligence process where we look at a number of factors, but we look, for example, at can we maintain the standard of security that we deem the minimum necessary for a given project, taking into consideration vulnerability of populations, fragility of the context we operate in, complexity of the stakeholders involved, all of that. And one example, for example, would be in humanitarian assistance. We've been approached, for example, to deliver trucks that deliver condoms to individuals, especially in refugee areas. And in that case, what they wanted to do was understand exactly who's getting condoms and who's not getting condoms. From our perspective, if you look sort of at the compromises you'd have to make on the security level for a very marginal benefit, that just didn't make sense. And that's just one example where utility is also very subjective. It's a perceived utility, whereas security is a bit more absolute when you think about data security. And we very often see a discrepancy between what we deem as minimum security necessary and the perceived utility that people estimate when they come to us with a request. Another example is for actually larger programs, and this links into the overhead of doing this and to my appeal to all of you later. For large programs, we actually hire external consultants to do a wide-ranging due diligence that is then presented to the board and approved by the board. But that is something that costs us tens of thousands of pounds of unrestricted surplus cash that we have to, as a nonprofit, find somewhere, right? And why do we have to do this? Because very often, a lot of the implementers, which might be in this room, and I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but a lot of the implementers do not do that due diligence themselves, and so they're offloading that risk and that cost to the technology providers, which very often just ignore that, or if they don't ignore that, they have to spend a lot of money to catch up. Coming to another example is sometimes we have to pull out of an existing project because the actors implementing have changed what their perceived utility is. So we had, for example, a program where we were, this is not humanitarian, but it's a good example. We were tracking ghost teachers in a country. So there was an assumption that there were a lot of ghost teachers who are essentially, not in school, and that has a huge impact on education outcomes. And we did a pilot where we proved that that was true, and we put a number to it, we could prove what the amount was, but then the implementing partner wanted to tie this to salaries. And this is where, for us, from a privacy perspective, it got quite awkward, because suddenly, if you didn't consent, there was no consent anymore. You had to provide your biometrics. If you couldn't or you didn't, you wouldn't get paid anymore. And so for us, again, we couldn't maintain our privacy security guideline, and so we had to drop out, and we were basically like, look, we can advise you on other standards and partners, but we're not going to be part of this. And coming to the humanitarian context, I mean, some of you might know we've done work in Nigeria, in Somalia, and Uganda on cash transfers, but we've taken a step back since. And the reason is that sort of the humanitarian sector provides a whole nother range of complexities that you're much more familiar with than I am. And there are actually plenty of players even providing biometrics who pride themselves on the speed at which they can deploy biometrics. We definitely don't do that, and we're actually proud that we don't do that, because it's not about speed, it's about diligence, it's about risk mitigation. And frankly, for us right now, it's quite difficult to guarantee the standard that we require in most projects that come our way, which is why we're focusing primarily on global health, because actually it's a much easier, in parentheses, setting to operate in, trying to hone our skills and lower the costs of doing risk mitigation and risk assessment so that we can then potentially go back in the humanitarian sector and do things, but do them properly. And actually, if anyone has thoughts on this, I'd love your assessment, because we are in a period of reconsidering how and if to operate in this sector. And what I'd like to finish on is really this idea that you started off, Anna, around shared risks. I hope that sort of from my examples, it's become clear just how much overhead is put and how much trust you frankly put in a third party to do the risk assessment that you should be doing in your programs. So it comes back to this idea of shared risk, and essentially, how can we make sure that by the time something comes our way, there has already been some of this due diligence, some of this trade-offs between security and utility, and that then, even if you work with a for-profit biometrics company that might not be sharing the same humanitarian principles, that you can rest assured that the biometrics implementation will be appropriate, because that might at the moment not always be the case. But yeah, just some thoughts from us, but happy to take it forward in the question time as well.
I keep forgetting that I have a mic here, so. Wow. Thank you. I hadn't thought about it in these terms, in terms of the offloading of risk that happens. So we keep thinking about it downstream to implementing partners, but actually it's as much a case with the tech companies involved. And yeah, definitely would love to keep exploring the idea of that shared risk mentality. I hope also in the workshop that follows. Trade-off between speed and due diligence. So we're just not an attractive partner then. Anyway, coming to Linda now. Really with a key question. I know you've done a lot of work with organizations. You've taken very interesting approaches to how organizations can think about responsible data practices. And they probably come to you with a lot of their pain points when it comes to responsible data practices and the demands put on them by their funders. If you can reflect on that. And in the brilliant sense that you've done with the guest blog for us also, some key takeaways for practitioners would be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, apologies that I keep yawning. It's not that I'm bored; it's that I'm still jet lagged. So when I'm thinking about responsible data, I usually think of first this like sort of big picture that's ethics, and then kind of under the ethics, I think about digital safeguarding, and I think we're all thinking a lot about safeguarding, and for me, that's kind of the most logical place to think about the way that we treat data. And how are we safeguarding data? We need to take a lot of the same approaches to safeguarding data that we take when we safeguard, women or children or people who are part of our program. So I usually like to frame it, maybe just also because I have a background on safeguarding, but I think that's a place that it makes sense. And then kind of inside of digital safeguarding, I think about data privacy, data security, and that kind of area of data protection. I think as you have all said, everything can be risky. Everything is risky. So in the video, all those things are risky, but it's a question of how you manage the risk and how you mitigate the risk and the choices you make about who the risk falls on, which I think was your point. Does it fall on the most vulnerable? Does it fall on the small organizations, on the large organizations, on the donors? Who is actually the one that carries the burden of the risk? And then also with this idea of, the way that technology moves is going much quicker than the law can catch up. So although I love the GDPR so much, it's like my favorite thing because I think it brings an ethical sense into, sorry, it brings an, I know, but it brings all those trade-offs to light because you can choose this thing under the GDPR. Oh, but then you have to do these other things. Oh, well, you can choose this one. Oh, but then you have to do that. So it's a very balanced way of looking at data protection, and I really like it. Sorry, and I try to simplify it for people because it's a really long, boring legal document, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So we really need to think about the ethics because the law is behind ethics. I think in the U.S. there was some case about something happening on social media and the judges were saying, well, is that like a fax? And it was just like, no, it's not like a fax. It's completely different than a fax. And so if you don't understand social media, how are you making laws about it and how are you understanding these things? So the judicial side is way behind still. GDPR isn't even, caught up to what's going on with all the digital stuff now. So three of the things that I think about in terms of responsible data is around, as Joel said, using the data that you collect for better targeting, for understanding how you're going to allocate your funds, for making better decisions, but also not over-collecting and not collecting more data than you actually need, which requires planning, which I know humanitarians have harder time planning than probably the development sector, but it does require some sense of why do you want this data, what are you going to use it for, what's the purpose of having it. I think in cash you probably know that fairly well already. There's this aspect of transparency and accountability, and I always hear people talk about accountability to donors, and donors are really concerned about accountability, but we need to be also transparent and accountable to people about the data we're collecting and what we're doing with it and why we're collecting it and how long we're keeping it and all these areas that are related to informed consent. And then we have the data protection and security side. So those are kind of the three ways that I worked on a project with USAID that was trying to figure out how to encourage responsible data use, because they had already put out something about open data, and we're realizing that opening data isn't always a great idea, and that same with sort of this who's responsible for making sure the data that gets opened is okay to open. So sometimes donors think that the organizations are doing, the organizations think that the donors are doing it, and so there's this kind of misunderstanding about what are the risks involved in opening and sharing data. And so USAID put out considerations for responsible data use, and they use those three kind of areas that you need to balance in terms of data use, accountability and transparency, and then protection. But balancing that is really hard because, a lot of times when I work with organizations, they say, can you just tell us what to do? It's like, well, I can tell you how to think about what you should do, but I can't tell you what to do because you're working in completely different contexts. Are you talking about working with children? Are you talking about working with people, LGBTQ populations? Okay, if you work with LGBTQ populations, are you working in a country where that is under pain of death, or are you working in a country where that's okay? And so every context is so different, every project's so different, that it's really hard to kind of put red lines in the sand. People don't often like to think for themselves, but they also don't want you to tell them what to do. So it's kind of this thing of like, how do you put in place kind of guidelines, policies? And I think for me the best way is to really try to integrate it, to keep it simple, because you really can't just put absolute rules in place. Going back to the donor question, I think if you do, however, have some internal guidelines, or you have staff that are trained and aware, if you've thought about it, then you're going to have a much better case for going to a donor and saying, actually, we don't think that it's safe to do that. But if you haven't ever thought about it, then you're completely unprepared. It's like if the media comes to you and says, well, why did you have a data breach? You collected all this data about all these people and there was a data breach. And you're like, yeah, we never really thought about that. It's a different reaction than, yeah, we had this whole thing in place and somebody hacked us and it was this, that's a really different scenario of one is negligence. And one is that, you did everything you could to the best of your ability, the best of your resources, and something still happened, which it might. But at least you were as prepared as you could be. And I think, that's something that not all of our organizations are doing. And I think coming to the part that it feels really, really overwhelming. We don't know what's in the GDPR. Okay, some of us know what's in the GDPR, not everybody, because it's not everybody's job to read the GDPR. I don't know half the laws, that are related to other things that I don't work on. So I need guidance from someone. So someone in your organization should know about these things, but not everyone. And so I think one of the things that we need to do with organizational work is really break it down into manageable bits and pieces. I'm doing some work with CARE right now, and what we're going to be thinking about doing is creating sort of personas inside of the organization. So, what does an administrator at the country level need to know about understanding legal privacy laws in different countries? That's what maybe the legal person at the country office needs to know, which is really different than what a frontline staff working in health needs to know, which is really different than the HR person needs to know, which is really different than the finance team needs to know, which is really different from what the business development people need to know. So trying to figure out what are the kind of the minimum things that each type of person in your organization needs to understand about data privacy, data protection, especially business development, because a lot of times the business development folks enter into agreements, and if they don't know about what the data requirements are in those agreements, then they can be signing you up for a lot of stuff that you might not think is ethical later. So what do your business development people know about data? Because now data is everyone's job. Even if you don't have to know everything about it, you need to know the pieces about data that are relevant to your job and doing your job in an ethical way. So I think that's really important. Having a principled approach, we all have principles. And so one thing we did with Catholic Relief Services, for example, is we took their existing organizational principles. We said, okay, what does that mean for data? If you have a principle of subsidiarity, which means decisions should be happening as close to the location of their impact, what does subsidiarity mean when you're talking about data? Well, it means that people whose data you're collecting should have some sort of a say in what happens to their data. If they have a principle about dignity, I think of data as an extension of an individual. So if my photo is an extension of me, my health records are an extension of me, my financial records are an extension of me. If you think that I should be treated with dignity, then you need to treat my data with dignity. So that's kind of how we reinterpreted this principle that they have of dignity. So kind of going through your existing principles or humanitarian principles, thinking what does that mean for how we treat data is one way to kind of engage staff in thinking that data matters, and it matters in these very principled ways. Risk assessments and risk benefits are also really, really important. But I think, again, breaking that down, who benefits and who risks. A lot of times we find that all the risk is on the smaller organizations and on the individuals that we're working with, the communities we're working with, and we're offloading all the risk, kind of off to them. That's what happens when we ask people for consent, to be completely honest. Consent is a way of offloading risk to people and then saying, well, they consented. We asked them, they consented, so now we're not, we're no longer liable for what happens. And so we need to really think about the power dynamics and when we're doing risk assessments. And then I think the last thing that I'll say, or second to last thing, is that I think donors are open to these conversations, and I think a lot of times people, we say, oh, well, the donors are making us do this. And yes, they are making you do this a lot of the time, but if you push back and you say, actually, we have our own data policy that says we don't do that, so let's talk about that and let's come to some sort of agreement on it. Or as a community, as the cash community, we decided that we think this thing is too risky to do. We're not going to do it anymore, and we're going to really advocate for you that we're not going to do it. So how can you kind of come together as a sector and figure out what are the things that you think are that make you uncomfortable, that you feel are unethical in terms of how you're collecting or using data, and then how can you have an organized approach back to your donors. And then the last thing I want to say is there are tons and tons of resources out there. Not a lot of them are very specifically oriented towards, the cash sector. But I think that there's so much out there. I have a huge list that I can share a link with you of, we've been just collecting resources about data responsibility for the last, 4 or 5 years. And there's going to be something that you can take and adapt to the work that you're doing in your organization. So don't create more resources, maybe adapt resources to your particular situations. But I don't think we need to create tons and tons more resources because there's a lot already out there.
100%. Yes, 100% agree, and that was very much the theme coming out of the April conversation we had in Geneva, that, don't give us any more. There's plenty out there, but we just need to start using it, know how to navigate it, and simplify it, maybe. But also, good call for everyone, that it's actually data, thinking about data as an extension of an individual. So if you're treating an individual with dignity, you treat their data with dignity. Again, some food for thought. I think we've eaten quite a bit into the questions time, but let me open the floor now to questions and take 3 maybe, and see how we go.
Yeah, it's Sam Carpenter from DFID. I thought Jos's point was really interesting about making it more practical. So it seems quite abstract to me, a lot of the discussion about risk, and it also seems quite sort of in the Western world, the European world, or North America. And I thought, I like the point I think Rick made from Oxfam about moving from a bit more of the compliance to something on rights. And I think rights is obviously when you come to think about protection. I know there are examples. You're starting to look at, in protection, you would look at, well, what is the threat and what is their vulnerability to that threat, not just from a data compliance GDPR. And we're talking about, in some of these situations, armed conflict, where there's actors without benign intentions. There is military intelligence and so on. And what are the specific risks? And if we looked at those risks, would it would it make agencies take things more seriously than just talking about, nebulous risk? What does that mean in terms of harm for people that are affected and at risk? Thanks.
Thank you. I think the fading orange and then Dina.
Thank you very much for the the panel discussion. Very interesting. I really liked your point about the fact that informed consent is actually also very much sometimes just transferring the risk, and especially in the humanitarian context, is that really realistic? And I understood that there will be a discussion about this as well later, but I think that's absolutely key as a starting point. And on the GDPR, are we really clear on when it applies or not? Because it depends of where the data are stored, for instance. So when we work in humanitarian context, what are we 100% clear of, when it applies or not? Basically, that's my question. Thank you.
Mine was really similar, actually. I was really interested in this discussion comes up a lot, right, about consent, and I do also like the idea that it's a transfer of risk. And we talked about this in the grand bargain meeting too, about like how it's not really consent when you're like, I'll give you cash, can we use your data? People are going to say yes, right? So I'm interested in, like, from the rights-based approach and also from what you were saying, what your perspective is, or if anyone else has sort of thoughts about that. Oh, I'm Dina from CRS. Amos, we know each other like on the phone.
Let's take one from Ron, yes.
I think informed consent's a very good phrase, but would there be occasions where you would be actually saying the risk is high, but we need your consent so we can help you? If we don't get your consent, we can't help you. Are you ever going to be in that position? And so it's not really informed consent. It's simply something the organisation has to do to protect itself, because the organisation must survive to provide the assistance. And sometimes you may have to ask that question, will you consent even though we advise you the risks are very high because we can't help you otherwise?
Thanks, Ron. Okay. First one for vulnerability and threats analysis and the parallels with protection. Can I actually come to Seb for that and then to Amos?
Can I start, because I think I can contribute most on the consent side. Just as an example, we've been doing a lot of work on consent, especially around biometrics, because it is special category data in the GDPR, and it requires specific levels of lawful basis for processing. One thing that I would like, just again, in terms of a framework, there's we think of consent a lot here around as a legal requirement, and then we debate, do we have genuine informed consent as defined in the GDPR when it comes to humanitarian assistance or health projects or whatever. The way that we would like to potentially spin the narrative is more seeing informed consent as a right. So it might mean that I saw the ICRC policy recently, for example, and they said their lawful basis for processing is public and vital interest, which makes a lot of sense. So they tick the legal box in the GDPR, not with consent, because they said because of power dynamics, there's no informed consent. We're actually going to use two other lawful bases because there's 6, not just consent. But our approach is then you should still advocate for some of the principles of consent wherever you can, in terms of making the data processing as clear and intelligible as possible to the people who are giving their data. So again, it's just one thing that I would add to this is thinking of consent not just as a legal requirement, because that's where a lot of the debate here stems from. Thinking about it more, there are other legal ways to tick the GDPR box, but thinking of consent more as something empowering that can increase the rights of the individual.
Jos, and then Amos, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to follow up on that and say, and I'm borrowing this from someone, but the informed part of informed consent, the informed part is a thing in and of itself, right? So the way we provide information to ask for informed consent is a very, can be a very helpful and important thing, right? It's not just about the actual provision of the consent and ticking that box.
You should just do consent first and then go to the other one, because I want to add about consent.
Okay, well, I'm thinking it's a good call we're recording this podcast because there's clearly a need for the conversation. But please, are you reacting to consent or to vulnerability?
Well, I can react to both of them,
Both,
but
please. Because I think it's also an important point.
so I think just I've written a lot about consents and informed consents. I think the things I'd throw out just into the conversation, similar to Jos, is kind of the informed bit. So what's the around, how do we think about awareness? What's the awareness we're creating? I think the other piece for me around consent is you can't really have consent unless you have alternatives. So to Ron's point, look, if the option isn't, if there isn't another option, then let's not talk about consent, because you can't. Simon, can you help me remind me of the part about the conflict part of the question? You act at the end something.
I use the word vision, doing any actual analysis of the threats and specific vulnerabilities that people have, or what threats they're exposed to through the data that you hold, rather than just talking about risk in an abstract sense.
Right. Okay. So I think. Right. So you asked for a specific example. So I think there's definitely. We're doing a lot of work in fragile contexts and trying to understand how to better operate there, probably like most organizations here. I think to try to make it really tangible, one of the things that data, so we can talk about PII as Anna and Jos mentioned earlier, but once you anonymize data, you can still re-identify people, right? And our laws don't protect us from that. And so you can re-identify quite easily, and then, frankly, to kind of, hopefully this will work. But anyways, so the more that organizations start using artificial intelligence, and there's lots of bias within that, to analyze data, to do data analytics, you're starting to kind of create this vicious circle that says, okay, we're going to, quote unquote, anonymize data. We're going to use all these data sets to try to understand risk. And you talked about military intelligence and stuff like that. In the context in which that we're working, they're also doing that. And then you get the sense of, okay, even if it's not 100% accurate, well, it's 90% accurate or there's a 5% chance that there is a terrorist or someone who is deemed a security threat in this particular area. So that, in an intelligence community, that may be enough to take action in that spot, and we may be inadvertently contributing to creating the data that allows them to do that. And I think that may be too abstract, but at the same time, this is really kind of one of the things that we're struggling with is then how do we operate in a fragile context that's highly vulnerable, where you got lots of different actors playing, and yes, there's certain things that we as a NGO, and frankly a fairly large NGO, there's certain decisions that we can make individually or as an individual agency, but at the same time, we're part of a humanitarian community and getting told to do certain things by other donors. So it's difficult. And frankly, if anybody has sorted it out, I would love to talk to you, because it's a huge struggle, and I don't have an answer to it. But we know that it's there, and we're frankly, hopefully stumbling forwards, but sometimes we stumble backwards.
I think Linda wanted to react to the consent point, and then yours.
Okay. The first point around sort of where does GDPR apply, I think there are two different answers. One is the legal sense of it applies if you have an entity that is headquartered somewhere in the EU, or your data is going to be passing through, residing in, directed to be collected by someone who is in sort of physically or has a legal entity based in the EU, or if you are targeting specifically EU citizens. So that's kind of the official definition of the GDPR, but most of people that I work with in the humanitarian and the development community feel like that's not really fair if only EU citizens have data protection. because it seems a little colonial. So we kind of try to figure out why should we get data protection, and then we're not extending those same rights and rights to privacy and data protection to the people that we're working with. So that's kind of the ethical approach to the GDPR, is that we take the highest possible legal framing that there is, and we apply that, and we try to give those same rights to everyone. So that's kind of around the territoriality of GDPR. I should probably say I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me. I think you have to say that when you give legal advice that's not really legal advice or something. I don't know. And then around consent, basically, what Jos said is that there are different, or I don't know who said it, but there are different inside of GDPR, different lawful bases for data collection. One of them is informed consent. One of them is legitimate interest, which is the one that the ICRC is using for their biometric collection right now. They've decided to go with that. Again, why I love the GDPR, if you decide to not get informed consent, then you take this other legitimate interest road. It means then you have to do a lot, you have to jump through a lot of other hoops. You have to do a data privacy impact assessment, which is very close to a risk assessment, and you have to do a documented risk assessment that says that you have looked and that your collection of this data isn't going to violate the rights and the interests of the people whose data you're collecting. You have to document that. And it doesn't save you from informing people and being transparent. It just means that the risk is taken on by the organization, and you've sort of laid out all the ways that you are going to ensure that your right to that data is not impinging on the other person's right to privacy and protection and all of their other legal rights that they would have. So it's just a different, it's a way that I think that humanitarians might be better off kind of taking on that risk. It's almost like a duty of care when you think about legitimate interest, and that's when it might be a better lawful basis. But we haven't talked about it enough in the humanitarian community, which is why we're going to do this podcast later. Yeah.
Thanks, Linda. Jos, and then Rick.
So just coming back to Simon's question and Amos's points on risk, I think one example of risk that we've seen at the Center for Humanitarian Data relates to the platform that we host for the exchange of data. So we've never allowed any personal data on the platform according to our terms of service, but we do get some survey data and other micro data shared via HDX sometimes. So at some point, we were alerted by a user of the fact that even if there are no names and unique identifiers in this data, it could still be possible to re-identify an individual. And so we took action. We immediately took down this particular data set and all data sets like it. And we started using a technique called statistical disclosure control, which allows us to measure the risk of that re-identification. So I think that's a very concrete example of risk. The other point I'll make is, so I mentioned these case studies that we're developing together with the World Economic Forum, and there we intend to sort of dive a bit deeper into what these different categories of risk look like and how likely they are to materialize in different contexts. So more soon there.
Okay, Rick, do you want to respond now, or otherwise we have a question queuing online, and then I thought we can do another round before breaking up for coffee. Yeah.
I can just quickly, a couple of points for me. When we're talking about the consent, I think there's two pieces. One is, so I think, lean towards finding other mechanisms. If you find a legitimate interest mechanism, that does your legal part. Then there is still that ethical part where we do need to, and it's not getting consent, but it's the informing piece. So even though we've gone down the legal side and we are covered, we still need to explain to people what it is we're doing. And I think for me there's a difference between informed and understanding. So we take it as we have told someone something. We very rarely check whether that actually made any sense whatsoever to the person involved. It's me reading terms and conditions of something. I tick yes without really fully knowing what it is. So informed can be, it's just semantics, but it means very different things. And then just around the risk piece, so a practical example in our data management pack, we have guidelines around taking photos in particularly humanitarian cases and trying to, de-identify, don't take photos of people's faces. There's lots of ways you can tell a story without identifying a person through a photograph. Now, photos are very powerful. If you're telling stories around gender-based violence, it can be really a core part of the story. But if you focus really closely on not revealing who it is in the words, and then you have a nice photograph of them, it doesn't really help the case. So we have a lot of guidelines on how we know the risks of if you show a photo of a woman or a child who's been involved in certain cases, you don't want that getting out into the community. So we do have guidelines, and that's a very practical example. But I think the introduction of sort of PIAs is something we're doing a bit more of, and trying to get beyond risk. It was explained, risk is looking for that thing that's wrong, whereas the PIA is more looking at trying to make sure everything is right, and just as a slight change.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, we'll take one more round of questions. We have Jackie and one online. Do you want to do the online?
Yeah, I can do online. Hello to everyone who's watching online. This is from Kevin, although I'm afraid I don't know his organisation, but he had a question around you saying that the recipients are the very proprietors of their own data, which I think is about the extension of self bit we were talking about, right? Okay, I will come to Jackie.
Thank you. I'm Jacqueline Fries here for CashCap today. I'm wondering if the panelists can give us some ideas or advice in the current cash transfer landscape that we're working in. How do we take some of that data responsibility good practice that you're discussing into another stage of the project cycle, which is where we're doing assessment and where we're talking about information of crisis-affected people, and then suddenly becomes data of our beneficiaries. There's like a huge jump there between our assessment phase where we talk about information, but when we've got our registration and our delivery mechanism, suddenly it's data and it's about beneficiaries and no longer the non-beneficiaries. Any good practice from data responsibility that we can take up to that part of the project cycle?
Thank you. This has been super interesting. I mean, one of the things that I really liked is this idea of data as an extension of the person. And it made me think, so I currently advise some startups, and some of you might understand how crazy that can get. So please don't shoot the messenger. So some of the ideas are around developing systems to allow people in vulnerable situations to profit from their own data. So basically to make money out of the data that agencies already consume and just extract without any extra benefit. So from a humanitarian point of view, in terms of like the humanitarian principles, I'd like to get your very kind of objective opinion on that, balancing the practicalities and the fact that this startup, for example, has, I don't know, done a lot of focus group discussions, and people are like, yeah, absolutely, yeah, I'd love to get some money out of my data. So how do we balance kind of people's own preferences with our own principles?
Thank you. Catherine Titch from World Vision. My key question is, and I think we're all still struggling, those that are implementing at field level. We're talking a lot about data protection and the principles. One of the aspects that our colleague from Oxfam has highlighted is, the informed consent issue. But the issue is really, what are we undertaking as humanitarian practitioners to ensure that there is information about the risks out there? I wonder, we had many years of health awareness, many of us who have been involved in, the issues around AIDS and awareness raising with communities that has really contributed significantly to changes in the threat of the disease and spreading. We are not taking that serious for data and digital literacy, are we? Because I do think one of the issues is we have a spectrum, as Paula just said, right? There is some community members that see, well, we can make money with our own data. Then there's other community members that may not even understand why, putting the digital fingerprint on something may have dramatic implications for their lives. So we have that whole spectrum, but what are we really doing about it? I do not feel an outcry of the humanitarian community around this need to push forward, and not only us, it must be even different actors, governments, private sector. So just challenging a bit the channel. Thanks.
Okay, I've learned my lesson. So who wants to respond to the first question, which was an online questions, recipients as proprietors of their own data? Linda, maybe?
I feel like we had kind of 3 questions that were centered around kind of data ownership. So I think the system that you were talking about kind of allows people to say, I own my data, I'm going to put it in the blockchain, I'm going to, you know, get paid for people to use my data. And the concerns I have around, I think sometimes people call that self-managed data. And my concerns around that is I think, one, by the time, I don't think people are going to earn very much money off of that data. I don't think anyone has a true sense of what their own data is worth. Like, is my data worth $5 or $750? I have no idea, and no one's going to tell me. So I think it's a really complicated notion about sort of ownership and making money off of your own data. I think it's quite complicated, and I think you set up, again, opportunities for exclusion and for differential treatment of people. The people that know more about data will know more about what their data is worth, and everyone else is going to kind of get screwed probably. So I'm not sure that I love that idea. I think people are owners of their own data, but I think ownership is not the right framework here. That there's some really good stuff that's written about it. I can't remember all of the reasoning behind why it's not a good framework, but I can give resources. I think Privacy International has just recently written a really nice paper about why data ownership is the wrong frame for it. So that's all I'll say. I think you want to say something too.
Just because I want to build directly on that. In the ID space, I mean, you touched on sort of self-managed data. There's this concept of self-sovereign identity or self-managed identity. And a good example, or the main example always given, is Estonia, where essentially the entire ID system is essentially based on self-sovereign identity, where you as a citizen have decide entirely who gets access to your data, and they have essentially a completely decentralized ID system that is focused on the citizen first. And it's pretty radical, pretty amazing, very often cited. Operating in the ID space, honestly, that is the gold standard. And if we were able to achieve that in some of the contexts where we operate in, we would be all for it. But if you look at the on-the-ground realities and what would be needed to get there, it's just a utopia. But I would still say that in terms of an ideal, having people, I mean, in the GDPR, data ownership is defined as you own the data and you have certain rights as a result. From an ID perspective, we would definitely want to reach a place where people, you know, are empowered, can access their own data, can decide which humanitarian agency gets that. But in the absence of that, we sort of have to fall back on current realities. And the current realities are centralized data systems, centralized ID systems, which come with a ton of problems and a ton of risks. And that's why right now, I think it comes back to sort of trade-offs between security and utility that I mentioned before. And while we would love something like Estonia to be in place everywhere, I think we're far away from that.
Well, you can apply to be an e-citizen. You can apply to be a citizen of Estonia. Anyone interested? Online. Amos.
Just to follow on this a little bit. So as much as there's a part of me that is a huge fan of kind of decentralized identity and self-sovereign, that whole conversation in space. I think the flip side is when we talk about data ownership, we need to be really clear about what data are we talking about. Because often, again, we bat around the term, but we think we know what everyone's talking about, but we probably all are thinking different things. So I think definitions are really important, and partly why is that on the one hand, we want complete control over our data. On the other hand, we don't. Like if you think about it, right, you go, okay, so if every individual has complete ownership and control over all of their data, and every time somebody wants that, right, you're going to be inundated with messages that say, can I access this? Can I access this? Can I touch this? Can I touch this? Right? You're going to be like, go away. Right? So like, that's part of the other extreme. The other part is if you think about products, to use a completely different example, but it's the idea of, in some sense, we want companies to know how we use the products that they produce for us so that they can make better products over time. There's a part of that we want them to understand how their products and services are being used so that they can be improved. The flip side of that is that we get really annoyed when our data gets used in ways that are unexpected. So we're okay with people using our data, we just don't like surprises. And I think, again, it's that piece of having, there's that part. Yes, I really like the idea of individually owning and controlling and having access to my own data. At the same time, there is collective benefit in living in a community when it's not all about me. Because I can guarantee you, not everyone here wants to live like me. And that's a good thing for society, right? So that's, again, it's those trade-offs, the spectrum, how do we manage that in the conversation even around data ownership? And I would completely agree with Linda. I think ownership is probably not the best term or way of defining that, because it puts us into a different direction than I don't think that we want to go.
Thanks, Amos. I am really sorry, guys. We've done amazingly well with, amazingly badly, I should say, with time management. So I've had the look twice now from Rose, and can I suggest that the conversation continues over coffee? The panelists are staying with us. And also, please, the questions that we haven't been able to respond to, park them with me, park them with Rose, and we'll try and get to them in the podcast. We'll record as much as we can for perhaps 2 or 3 episodes that we now need. It sounds like so. But please, a huge round of applause for this amazing guys. And because we've eaten into the coffee break, can I suggest we have 20 minutes? So come back into the main room at 5 past, and then we'll give you instructions on what to do next.